The harmony of Tchaikovsky's Sixth Symphony in B minor, Pathétique, Movement 4, Adagio Lamentoso, by Danny Choi. The Sixth Symphony, commonly known as the Pathétique, was composed in 1893, and it was the last of Tchaikovsky's symphonies. The work lasts about 15 minutes, and while Tchaikovsky originally wanted to call the symphony Program Symphony, after consulting with his brother, he decided to call it Pathétique. And the original epithet that Tchaikovsky used meant passionate or emotional, but when it was translated into French, it was called pathétique, which in the English language sometimes evokes pity. However, this is not the case. Tchaikovsky meant passionate and emotional. The work is in 4 movements, the first being in B minor and also the longest movement, about 20 minutes long in sonata allegro form, also featuring a very famous melody. The second movement, on the other hand, is in D major, and it's a dance movement in 5/4. The G major third movement is a triumphant march, and it's often mistaken as a finale. For example, at the most recent UBC Symphony concert, the audience got up applauding at the end of the third movement, not knowing that the last, most depressing movement, the fourth movement in B minor, Adagio Lamentoso, would be coming next. The final movement is a slow movement full of tense harmonies, sad, and it's almost like a downward spiral towards death. The 5 other symphonies that Tchaikovsky composed, and also the other Manfred Symphony, all follow a minor to major, tonic major that is, trajectory. This work, however, begins in minor and ends in minor. The work was first performed under Tchaikovsky himself in St. Petersburg. Because the performance was 9 days before his death, there has been speculation and controversy over the significance of the symphony. Tchaikovsky had told people that the symphony had a program. However, Tchaikovsky refused to disclose the program, and it remained private. With the private program, Tchaikovsky wanted to leave any interpretation open to audiences because each person would have different interpretations. Now, before writing this symphony, Tchaikovsky had written another symphony in E-flat major, but eventually he discarded it because he didn't like the harmony and he thought that there wasn't any substance to the symphony. And in 1893, in a letter to his brother, Tchaikovsky mentions this new work, saying, "I am now wholly occupied with the new work, and it is hard for me to tear myself away from it. I believe it comes into being as the best of my works. I must finish it as soon as possible, for I have to wind up a lot of affairs, and I must soon go to London. I told you that I had completed a symphony which suddenly displeased me, and I tore it up. Now I have composed a new symphony, which I certainly shall not tear up." The fourth movement, the finale, marked Adagio Lamentoso, is in sonata rondo form, which of course is a mixture of the traditional sonata form and the classical rondo form, used a lot by composers like Mozart and Brahms. Also, it features an extensive use of second inversion triads and seventh chords, which is quite unusual, and also a lot of diminished and half-diminished seventh chords, which is typical for many romantic compositions of this time. One of the biggest features that makes this movement particularly sad is the extensive use of suspensions and appoggiaturas, which have so much tension and release throughout the whole symphony, creating such a huge emotional impact on the audience. The symphony also has a lot of motivic and harmonic elaboration through the use of sequences, although they're not always strict sequences. The Exposition features 2 themes, A and B in B minor and D major. While the development does not depart that much from these 2 themes, however, certainly does add many changes. The development section is also quite tonally ambiguous because it moves around quite a bit through the use of sequences, so there's not really a tonal center for more than 2 bars. Finally, the Recapitulation features the A section returning almost the same way, although a lot more agitated and a lot more passionate. And finally, the second theme returns, this time in minor, until it goes to a slow dying away, fading away close. One very interesting thing to note in the score is the use of the cross motif, which was also used in the first movement of the symphony. The cross motif is most commonly associated with the crucifixion. Of course, one of the most famous ones in the canon is the Bach motif, B flat A C B natural. Cross motif can be seen in all the lines of the strings. However, these strings also work together, interlocking with each other to create a melodic line, which is a descending B minor motif. Because of the interlocked crossing in the string parts, the melody is passed around between the first and the seconds. And especially if an orchestra is seated in old-style seating, like many of the orchestras during Tchaikovsky's time would have been, the first and second violins would be seated across from each other, creating a stereo effect across the concert hall. Anyways, now let's dive into the harmony. The movement begins immediately in the exposition, with the first theme being presented. The first chord is very strange. It's a sharp 6, half diminished 4-3. But it could also be looked at as a 1-6 chord with an added sharp 6. Either way, the chord creates a sort of ambiguity at the start of the piece, and it's very hard to tell what key the piece really is in. The B minor element can only really be heard with the descending melody line, which is 5 notes of the B minor scale, and also because the 2-bar phrase ends with a half cadence on a 5-7 chord. The phrase repeats again with an appoggiatura this time, creating more tension. Next, the second motif of the first theme is heard, which is a string of suspensions and sequences. These suspensions and appoggiaturas really deliver the emotional elements of the piece with the constant tension and release. Similarly, throughout the piece, and also in a lot of Tchaikovsky's music elsewhere, Tchaikovsky uses sequences to venture from the tonal center and create more and more tension. Of course, like most composers, no sequence is going to be perfect because that's boring. So Tchaikovsky also tends to vary these sequences quite a bit. Next, the first theme is repeated, and instead of using sequences to venture off from the tonic this time, the second motif of the first theme stays in D major or B minor. After a descending bassoon solo, the horns enter, establishing a dominant pedal in D major. Of course, it's worth mentioning that Tchaikovsky himself was a very masterful composer of harmony. During his time in the Conservatoire in Moscow, he wrote Guide to Practical Study of Harmony. And in that book, he calls pedals organ points because they're basically the same thing. It's based on the pedals of an organ, which was often held under other harmonies. As the B section begins, the second theme enters in D major. Similar to the first theme, this theme is also a descending melody. Again, this theme makes use of suspension, and the bass line is a counterpoint line, also featuring suspensions. Next, with the extension of the suspension idea, fragmentation occurs. As Tchaikovsky takes the theme and raises it with sequences, each harmony acts kind of like a suspension in that rather than 1 or 2 notes being dissonant and then resolving, the whole chord is dissonant, an applied 5 or 7 chord, and then it resolves, while the melody line has the same suspension-like figuration. Next, the theme is repeated, however this time with a different harmony. Instead of using the 5-1 motion, he goes 5, 7 of 3, and then 1-6, which creates a bigger pull towards the tonic. Then this time, instead of suspensions, Tchaikovsky uses retardation and ascending appoggiaturas along with the crescendo and more movement in the tempo to heighten the intensity of the music until finally it lands on another repetition of the theme, this time even more passionate in more octaves and a thicker orchestration. He then goes on, just like before, except with thicker orchestration and more intensity with dynamics. And finally, at the end of the descending sequence, the orchestra lands on a B minor chord in first inversion. With the timpani rolling and the full brass fanfare, it's almost as if this main character of this quote-unquote private program is having a moment of overcoming the struggle, as if he's almost making it through all this despair. Next, this descending theme is elaborated, getting faster and faster as it comes down, kind of centered around C major, which is a somewhat unrelated key to B minor or D major, unless it could be considered as extended Neapolitan chord in B minor. But even then, it's still very much out of place, perhaps due to the nature of the program. After the motif lands on C major, there's a long fermata, until finally the strings break the silence once again, playing a different version of the second theme as the development section begins. It's a very passionate but fragmented statement of the second theme in B minor. At the bottom of the descending motif, each cadence ends with a suspension. The suspension part is then elaborated and repeated until finally the first theme seems to return. However, this time the interlocked crossing of the strings is not present, and it seems to be more insistent. The end of the theme is varied again, just like all the other times, and this time it stays in B minor as it quickly goes back into the first theme again. Instead of going into the second suspended motif, the first motif is elaborated, repeated again and again, higher and higher and higher with a string of sequences, until finally it lands at moderato assai. At this point, B minor is almost completely gone. The landing point is an A minor triad, of course buried under a suspension. And this section especially is so tonally ambiguous that Roman numerals don't really mean anything here other than just describing what the chord is, because the most important part is the passion. Now, while we can't be rooted in B minor, there is something that still kind of brings that sense into the music. With the suspensions resolving, each time it resolves, it features the notes of a B minor scale, although the F is natural. Each time it comes back, it's descending from B to A, G to F, E to D, and C sharp to B. Finally, the recapitulation comes. With A prime, theme 1 returns in its most aggressive rendition, while stopped horns play a dominant pedal under the strings, creating a kind of raspy and agitated tone. The theme is repeated again, transposed down a fifth with the same dominant pedal. Then following that passionate rendition of the first theme, the suspension is fragmented once more as it diminuendos and comes down. This is one of the most peculiar moments of the piece. A tam-tam rings out with the piano dynamic. Now, the tam-tam doesn't play anywhere else in the whole symphony, not even in the third movement with the march. This is the only note that the tam-tam plays in the whole entire symphony, and it's not even a loud roll. It's just a piano, calm, somewhat out of place, somewhat mysterious tam-tam strike. The only way I can justify this, again, like before, is possibly a programmatic element that Tchaikovsky had in mind. Ever since the tam-tam was introduced to the orchestra, it often had to do with funeral marches or elements that had to do with death or resurrection. So maybe this point is some kind of turning point in the narrative, but of course, that will remain a mystery. Next, the same suspension motif that was playing just before it is elaborated upon in a funeral-like brass chorale with rhythmic augmentation. And finally, with the last section of B prime, the second theme returns once more, but this time, it's fully in B minor with a tonic pedal. And rather than using a dominant to tonic 5-to-1 harmonization, and again different from the dominant and then diminished and then tonic configuration, Tchaikovsky uses a Neapolitan chord, followed by a diminished 2, and finally a 1. Next, the cellos repeat the theme down an octave until finally the piece dies away with morendo, finally sitting on a long B minor chord, with the offbeat pattern of the horns slowing down like the last few heartbeats before death. The piece truly is magnificent. It's one of my favorites. It's one of the most passionate pieces, and even after studying the harmony and dissecting the whole piece, I find myself loving the piece even more, being entranced by Tchaikovsky's genius of harmony. And despite all the unconventional parts of this harmony, he manages to hit all the heartstrings and really connects with the audience. Now, through analyzing this piece, the more I look at it, the more I think the piece absolutely must be played with extra passion and commitment. It has so many sensitive lines and so much expressiveness that a flat performance of this would be completely wrong. And these bits of passion and expressiveness can be brought with some extra vibrato in the strings, as well as high finger positions on the lower strings for a more strained, kind of muffled sound that's struggling to reach out. Next, a really good mastery of phrasing is required to highlight the high and low points of the symphony, as well as the tension and release that's constantly everywhere in the movement. I keep saying this, but all the suspensions are so important. They really need to be pressed on with the dynamics and also with the tempo. And many of these spots are indicated in the score, so they just need to be more consistently scattered around the movement. A challenge for the conductor is that the tempo requires a lot of patience because it's so sensitive. But then, in the moments of emotional outburst and all the stringendo and the incausando markings, the tempo really has to rock it off. It's almost as if there's a glimpse of hope. It's like the character is reaching out from the depths, trying to grasp for light. Every time there's intensification, and every time there's an outburst, there's equally a subdued section. And finally, old-style seating needs to be used for the maximum effect of the stereo string phrase crossing. My favorite performance of the piece was by the Seoul Philharmonic Orchestra under the baton of Maestro Jung Myung-un, which I have attached a link to. The orchestra uses the old-style seating, and the maestro really pushes and pulls the tempo in bursts of passion. And this passion really reflects the epithet, Pathétique. The performance also has extreme expression and emotion. And at the end of the performance, as the final B minor chord rings out, the concert hall is absolutely silent in awe. And at 49 minutes and 25 seconds, the conductor sheds a tear after that overwhelmingly emotional performance. All in all, studying the piece was absolute enjoyment for me. While I'm really familiar with the first movement and also the orchestration throughout the symphony, I never really dared to dive into the harmony of the fourth movement because to me it seemed to have a suspended quality, not in the sense of a suspension, but it just felt like it was kind of hanging there in the air with no resolution until the very end. And all the chords seemed to be so complex that I never really thought of digging into the harmony. And I'm glad that through this project I did because I learned so much from it. It helped me appreciate the piece even more. And while in many sections I'm questioning Tchaikovsky saying, "Why would you use that chord here, Tchaikovsky?" I'm finding myself more entranced and more fascinated by these unconventional uses.